Food for thought. When talking about abusers, we should minimize or talk less about the fact that those abusers came from abusive childhoods or neglectful backgrounds. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying that they shouldn't get help for those things. I'm saying actually the opposite. What I'm saying is that we put so much emphasis on the fact that they were abused that we forget that their victims also come from abusive backgrounds. We forget that a lot of times victims of abuse, of emotional, verbal, physical abuse, often come from backgrounds where they themselves have been neglected, abused, and mistreated. A lot of times, those people who are so kind and compassionate also come from abusive backgrounds and behaviors, and they may be primed to accept abuse from other people because of what they had to endure themselves. See, when victims were abused as children and then they become adults and they choose partners or relationships where they're abused, it's because a lot of times their balance is off. Their scale is off on perceiving good and bad people. A lot of times they had to justify good behaviors in bad people, or they were around people who were bad or mistreated them, and they had to accept their breadcrumbs from them, which means that they looked at those people and they said, well, at least they do this. My parents weren't there for me emotionally. They neglected me and they minimized my hurt and pain. And they often made fun of my insecurities and they created a negative self-talk voice in my head, but they was provided and took care of me. That's what you usually will hear from victims. They've been primed to accept abuse from people. And a lot of times they don't recognize things are abuse until it's really bad. And it's not that they don't want to recognize this abuse, is that their filters off because they too have been abused. So while we're spending all this time empathizing with people who choose to abuse to cope with the fact that they're emotionally dysregulated human beings and refuse to get help, we're forgetting that victims are usually also a consequence of abuse, and that the reason they're in abusive cycles is because they've been primed to accept abuse as normal. A lot of times they will compare abuses between people. They'll say, well, this person isn't as bad as so and so, so therefore they must be good. Their filter and their lens is completely and totally off. There's no balance in their life. They have a hard time seeing good and bad people because they can find good things in bad people. And so therefore they don't understand how to pick and choose people and to be more judgmental, for lack of a better term, and to have boundaries. It's normal for us to use our judgment and discernment to weed people out of our lives, to say, we don't want this person to have access to us. We do want this person to have access to us. It's like my favorite poem by Robert Frost, and talks about fences. And it talks about what are we keeping in and what are we pushing out? What are we pulling? Where are we moving out of the situation? A fence keeps things in and also keeps things out. So you have to think about it this way. When someone's filter is broken, they are more perceptive to abuse. So the next time you want to victim shame someone and say you should have known better or chosen better, or you assume because that person is not the abuser that they're less broken than the abuser themselves, check yourself, have empathy and compassion, and recognize that both people in the situation most likely have been primed for abuse. One person chose to be too kind and compassionate out of their circumstances. They tried to make the best out of their circumstances. The other person is trying to control someone based off of their circumstances. They're making excuses for why they're abusing. We often think that people who abuse have been taught to abuse, and that is partially correct. Part of it is they know that the abuse is wrong, but they have chosen to abuse. Abusers make the choice to abuse. I want people to stop thinking like it's some sort of reactive thing that just automatically happens because that's what they've seen. That's all they know how to do. They know right from wrong. And here's another thing you want to keep in mind. Abusers know that abuse is wrong because they won't tolerate the same behavior that they give. They won't tolerate someone giving that same behavior to them. They won't tolerate a partner or friendships or relationships or even family relationships as adults who treat them the same exact way. They'll stand up for themselves. They'll talk about how wrong it is. They'll talk about how their family structures were dysfunctional and how they don't like everyone because of the way they are. And in the same vein, they'll turn around and mistreat you and abuse you and justify it. The problem with abusers is not that they don't know what's right and wrong, is that they justify abusive behaviors. And victims justify the abusive behaviors from their relationships because they've been primed to accept abuse. So abuse victims will often judge themselves, blame themselves or try to fix themselves in abusive situations rather than recognizing the situation in itself is dysfunctional and they should leave. Or they'll try to make the best out of a dysfunctional situation because they've been doing that their entire lives, and that's what their brains tell them is the right thing to do. You see a little bit of good as a victim, so then you think that that justifies a little bit of the bad. I see a little bit of good, so this person has the potential to be good, so maybe one day that I'll grow the bad. Victims have hope. Abusers often don't have hope, and that's why they manipulate. So hopefully this helped to frame the conversation. I don't ever want to hear people making excuses anymore, talking about have compassion on them because they had a bad childhood. Nobody ever stops to ask the victim, what was your childhood like? Because a lot of times they're going from abuse to abuse to abuse. And they're trying to figure out how to get out the cycle, and they don't even know how. If you speak to most abuse victims, they will often tell you, I thought I was choosing better than what I saw in my family, and I ended up in the same thing. I don't understand how. They lose trust and confidence in themselves because they're confused as to how they could potentially recognize something was wrong, work to not be the thing that they did not like, work to not be abusive and to mistreat people, and they work to be empathic and considerate and kind, and then end up with someone who resembles just like their family structure. It's because they've been primed for abuse and they haven't yet recognized it, or they've recognized it and they don't know how to get out of it. So thank you so much for listening. God bless you, and I'll talk to you soon.